Up next on In Depth, Robert Higgs, Senior Fellow in Political Economy at the Independent Institute.
Robert Higgs, before we get to your books, I want to ask you to respond quickly to some recent headlines in the paper and get your views on those. This is from the Financial Times. G20 leaders hail crisis fightback, 1.1 trillion global boost agreed. And along that same line is this headline, nations craft hard-fought pledge to repair world financial system.
This is what we would expect them to do, is pretend to know what they ought to be doing to repair the economic troubles we face right now and to come up with a program of some sort that is a plausible solution. I don't think it will be a plausible solution, or at least it won't be an actual solution, but it's what leaders do in the world.
Why don't you think it will be a plausible solution?
Well, the idea that the situation we're in can be repaired merely by spending a lot of money through governments, money that these governments in most cases don't even possess and will have to go into debt in order to spend, is really intellectually bankrupt. It's a holdover from what I call vulgar Keynesianism, a body of thought that's very popular among politicians and the public, but it has practically no scientific standing at all.
In the Politico, recent headline, Obama scores early win with budget vote, $3.6 trillion budget passed, $1 trillion plus deficit.
Politicians love to spend money. Every dollar of that makes someone beholden to the people who made it happen. So they're taking advantage of the situation. They're exploiting it to represent themselves as the saviors of the world and to direct money particularly to those people they favor for one reason or another, often people who help them get elected.
What do you think when you hear $3.6 trillion annual federal budget, $1 trillion deficit?
I'm appalled. These magnitudes would have been unthinkable not long ago, but we hear almost every week some enormous new government proposal for spending, lending, trading assets, guaranteeing, propping up, bailing out. This is the government policy of the day, and unfortunately I'm sure we're going to have more and more of it in the next few months and perhaps longer than that.
From the New York Times, U.S. plan seeking expanded power in seizing firms. Proposal is aimed at companies deemed too big to fail.
Well, they say they're too big to fail, but if they didn't bail them out, they would fail, and then we'd discover that the world kept spinning. It's a good story. It stokes people's fears, and nothing works better for a politician than making people afraid.
Has the government stepped in too much, in your view, in the recent months during this economic crisis?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Almost everything it's done, it has been, in my view, a mistake. And the kind of action that will actually make our situation worse and take us longer to get out of it.
And finally, the Wall Street Journal. Government forces out Wagner at GM.
It's a very bad precedent because Mr. Wagner really didn't work for the government of the United States, and yet we have the government presuming to decide who's going to be the manager of a private corporation. Of course, the private corporation is receiving great sums of money from the government in loans to keep it afloat, but nonetheless, this, I'm sure, will come back to haunt us because it moves us further and further in the direction of government control of the economic process.
Welcome to In Depth. This is Book TV's monthly series featuring one author and his or her body of work. We want to hear from you. Our guest this month is Robert Higgs, who is associated with the Independent Institute, and we'll ask him about that in just a minute. And here are some of his books, so you get an idea of what a political economist writes about and his views. Neither Liberty Nor Safety, Fear, Ideology, and the Growth of Government was written in 2007. In 2006, this book came out, Depression, War, and Cold War, Studies in Political Economy, published by Oxford. In 2005, I believe, Resurgence of the Warfare State, The Crisis Since 9/11. These are three of his books. Then there is Against Leviathan, Government Power and a Free Society, and Crisis and Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of American Government. And you can see here this pile of books. These are books that he's edited or contributed to also that we will get through in the next 3 hours. We want to put the phone numbers up in case you want to participate in our conversation. 202 is the area code. 737-0001 for those of you who reside in the East and Central time zones. 737-0002 for the Mountain and Pacific. And if you have a question throughout this 3 hours that you would like to email in to Dr. Higgs, booktv@cspan.org is the email address. And we'll begin taking your calls in about 10 minutes or so. Dr. Higgs, fear is a recurrent theme in all of your books, and in fact, it's in the subtitle of your most recent book. Why?
Because fear is the most elemental and powerful human emotion. It's the thing that human beings are least able to ignore. Fear also puts people in a frame of mind where it's very difficult for them to behave rationally. They're more likely to behave instinctively, and they're more likely to look for salvation wherever they can find it. And for that reason, governments have always relied on fear to keep subjects in line, and they're continuing to rely on it today.
Could you give an example?
Absolutely. Everything we know about how governments in their current form came into being tells us they arose from conquest, from one group over another group. And that meant that fear was involved in the very beginning because it was usually violence, warfare that brought about this conquest. And after the conquest was completed, the threat of violence continued to be applied to subject peoples in order to make them cough up tribute to their conquerors. And so fear for people's very lives is at the root of governments as they exist in the world today. And even though many people may not feel a surface fear or an awareness of fear of the government, it's very easy to make them afraid of government if you start to remind them of ways in which the government might hurt them if they get out of line.
From Crisis in Leviathan, published in 1987, this is what you write. We know that other great crises will come, whether they will be occasioned by foreign wars, economic collapse, or rampant terrorism, no one can predict with assurance. Yet in one form or another, great crises will surely come again. When they do, governments almost certainly will gain new powers over economics and social affairs.
We've seen it happen in the past 8 or 9 years, all three of them at once.
Example?
Well, the beginning, of course, is 9/11, which is a combination of rampant terrorism and war. It's represented as war. I think in many ways it's misleading to view it as such, but nonetheless, it evoked a government response known as the War on Terror or the War on Terrorism, and we've been at it ever since in some way. And the military activities of the United States in Afghanistan and in Iraq are direct consequences of that attack. Now, we've also had certainly economic debacle that became especially apparent starting in the summer of 2008 and grows steadily worse as the recession deepens. So we certainly have the economic problems that have caused a lot of fear and concern and political response. So we've got war, terrorism, economic troubles all at once right now.
In Neither Liberty Nor Safety, published 2007, you have a chapter called 18 Problematic Propositions in the Analysis of the Growth of Government. What are these propositions?
Well, there's a long list of them. That paper was actually written for my colleagues in economics and political science who've been studying the growth of government, and it was an attempt to identify mistakes they've made, as it were, ways they've gone about analyzing the growth of government that have been misleading, unproductive, or just outright wrong. And many of them involve ways of mischaracterizing either what the government is, what it does, or the way in which its growth proceeds. So they involve such things as how do we measure the size of government. The most common way for economists and political scientists is to take the ratio of government spending for currently produced goods and services to the gross domestic product, which is the total of all such spending. And that ratio can be tracked over time. We have data for the advanced countries that allow us to analyze it year by year. And economists love data like that. They immediately see an opportunity to apply econometric techniques, and so that's what they've done. This was all right as far as it went, but unfortunately, very often the government has grown in ways that don't show up in this measure because it simply doesn't track, doesn't allow us to discriminate sufficiently all the actions that government has taken and what their consequences have been or might be.
So what do you propose to either add to it or subtract from it?
My approach has been to look at a variety of measures, and particularly to look at evidence not simply of a statistical kind. When I wrote my book, Crisis and Leviathan, I made quite a bit of the idea that government power often increases even though it doesn't cause the ratio of government spending to gross domestic product to rise. And in fact, it may even occur when that ratio is falling. If the government were, for example, to begin conscripting soldiers rather than hiring them in the labor market, we might well see government spending fall because it wouldn't pay very much to the conscripts. But nonetheless, the movement from voluntary military service to conscription would certainly signify an increased exertion of the power of government.
Proposition 15 out of those propositions in neither liberty nor safety. Government grows in order to supply public goods that the public demands, but the free market will not supply. True or false?
Well, that's one of the standard rationales economists propose to account for the growth of government. I think it's a bad explanation in the sense that most of what the government has come to do over time doesn't even plausibly fit the category of being a supply of public goods. In economics, public goods are very strictly defined. They have to be goods that once produced are available to everybody, so they're non-rivalrous in their consumption. And they have to be goods from which no one can be excluded once they have been produced. And certainly most of the things that government does are not even approximately public goods. So it makes a good rationale in economic theory. It's good on the blackboard, but historically speaking, it's very weak.
You also write that the U.S. has more than 87,000 separate governments, more than 60,000 with the power to tax.
Yes. We have, of course, a national government, 50 state governments, more than 3,000 county governments, and then below that we have city governments and special districts of every imaginable kind. And many of these have the power to tax, besides the power to make rules that everybody subject to the jurisdiction has to obey.
How often are those rules conflicting?
Very often, as you would expect in such a complex system. In fact, you don't have to look at all these different governments. Within any one government, you often see rules that conflict.
Robert Higgs, what's the Independent Institute?
The Independent Institute is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization that's devoted to the study and education with respect to particularly public policy, but the interests of the Institute are much wider ranging, and the Institute takes an interest in many things that have some connection with public policy, but not necessarily at the policy stage at that moment. They study a variety of proposals for future ways to change policy, and they study the history of how policies have operated in the past, and so it's a very wide scope of interest at the Independent Institute.
How is it funded?
It's funded through private donations from individuals, foundations, corporations, and to some extent from its own activities, such as sales of books and reports.
Would you call it a free market think tank? Is that fair?
Oh, that's fair. It's certainly fair, yes.
How'd you get associated with it?
I became associated with it because I had known David Thoreau, who's the president of the Independent Institute, for a number of years before I left academia. And in fact, I dealt with him when he was the president of another such organization called the Pacific Research Institute. And when I did leave academia and I was looking around for a new place to land, David and I quickly got together and agreed that I could do something for the Institute, and so I've been doing something for it ever since.
And what were you doing in academia?
I was a professor of economics for 26 years, and
where'd you teach?
I taught for 15 years at the University of Washington in Seattle, and then at Lafayette College in Easton, Pennsylvania for 6 years, and then for 5 years at Seattle University.
Education?
Did it educate me?
No. What's your education? Sorry.
My education is that I have a bachelor's degree in economics from what was then called San Francisco State College, and a Ph.D. in economics from Johns Hopkins University.
In a book that you added a chapter to, Government and the American Economy, A New History, Douglas North writes, first of all, the book is, what's the word?
Festschrift.
What does that mean?
Well, it means it's a celebratory volume dedicated to me by friends and students.
Dedicated. That was the word I was looking for. Not a big word, just a little word. But it's dedicated, and Douglas North, Price Fishback writes, when most of us first met Bob, he was a free market economist who believed strongly that markets worked well. Over time, he has become more and more closely associated with libertarian and Austrian thought. What does that mean? Austrian thought.
Well, Austrian thought refers to the so-called Austrian School of Economics, which is very often distinguished in its views from what is now mainstream economics, but once upon a time was part and parcel of mainstream economics, and didn't really part ways until around the 1930s, when mainstream economics began to take a very different course. But the Austrians have stuck to their guns, and they differ in a variety of ways. Their conception of what economics is about and how it ought to be studied is different from mainstream economics, and their ideas about how the economy operates are quite different in some ways, not in all ways, because as I said, the Austrians were once simply economists among other economists and didn't stand out at all. And some of the great Austrians include Karl Menger back in the 19th century, and Eugen von Bohm-Bawerk, and after that Ludwig von Mises, F.A. Hayek. These people at the time were seen as making contributions to economic analysis in general, and are still seen that way to some extent, but particularly in the case of Mises and to a lesser extent Hayek, they are seen as mavericks or as people whose views do not comport well with the modern mainstream economics.
What would be one distinction between the Austrian school and what you refer to as mainstream?
A major distinction has to do with what Austrians conceive of as the scientific method appropriate to economic analysis. Modern mainstream economists think that the scientific method of economics ought to be basically the same one used in physics or chemistry. Hypotheses should be tested empirically to find out whether they are true, or at least whether they're not rejected yet and are provisionally acceptable. But the Austrians start with a conception of what they take to be axiomatic truths, and they proceed deductively from that, and the propositions they arrive at are accepted as necessarily true. They don't need any testing, and if we tested them and found them false, we would conclude there's something wrong with the test, which, by the way, mainstream economists often conclude also.
And who is Price Fishback, who wrote that?
Price Fishback is a dear friend of mine and was one of my Ph.D. students at the University of Washington in around 1980, early 1980s.
Our guest is Robert Higgs. This is C-SPAN's In-Depth program, and the first call for him comes from Evansville, Indiana.
First off, I want to thank C-SPAN for their programming. I'm an avid viewer. Mr. Higgs, I have a question. Earlier in the program, it became clear that you disagree with either many of the things our current administration may be deciding to do, or all of those things. Respectfully, what would you do, or could you pick out maybe one or two major decisions the current administration has decided to do in the last 60 days, or even a major decision the last 6 months of the previous administration, what they've done, and what you would propose in the alternative?
Well, let's go back to the original bailout plan of early October last year. This was an act of Congress to provide $700 billion originally for the purpose of having the government purchase so-called toxic assets from financial institutions. And this was a terrific mistake, and the government itself may have seen that because they never used the money for that purpose. Instead, they decided before long that they would use the money to inject capital into financial institutions, and so they did that, giving cash to banks and taking in exchange preferred shares and warrants, which is to say ownership stakes in those institutions. So that was the plan, and that was a disastrous plan, because not only did it mean that politically favored institutions got preferential treatment from the government at enormous expense to the taxpayer, but it also represented an intrusion in what should have been a market process, whereby institutions that had been badly managed, that had acquired assets that had little value and therefore were insolvent, ought to simply have been permitted to go bankrupt. The market system is a system of profit and loss. If badly managed institutions are not allowed to fail, then all the incentives are switched around. And what we end up with is a system of private profit and public loss, where the losses are socialized across all the taxpayers. More recently, we get to the Obama administration with its stimulus plan, another enormous package of spending projects, which are extraordinarily diverse, but probably the best simple way to describe them is to say that they represent handouts to virtually every interest group that the Democratic Party identifies as its friends. And much of the money is going to state governments and local governments, the federal government, of course, for a variety of sweet-sounding projects, such as green investments in insulating buildings and the study of global warming and whatnot. But if you go down the list, although it's often advertised as aimed at providing infrastructure projects, bridges, roads, what have you, a very small proportion of the total package is actually allocated to those purposes. It's pretty much a bailout or a prop up for government employees more than it is anything else.
And if you go to the Independent Institute's website or to the Christian Science Monitor, you can find this recent op-ed by Dr. Higgs. Instead of stimulus, do nothing. Seriously. Houston, Texas, thanks for holding. You're on with Robert Higgs.
Thank you. I appreciate the time to ask a question. I was calling because there's so much conversation now about how we're using this money, and there was a situation yesterday about a book regarding the ranking of the presidents, and one of our lowest-ranking presidents, Chester Arthur, during his administration, whether he can take credit for it or not, passed the Pendleton Act, which was basing government jobs on merit. And what I was wondering is with all the other opportunities that people have to rationalize why they do things, very seldom is it the best, is it the right thing to do. So I was wondering how you think we can get the country back on track by people following their conscience instead of what's easiest, best, legal, or profitable. Thank you.
Well, my motto would be don't just stand there, undo something. We live in a world where the government at every level has intruded into private life and into economic life in countless ways. And the consequences have been often destructive, often counterproductive, and we desperately need to reduce the size, scope, and power of government. If we were to do that, we would not be at constant risk of having the government foul up our lives. So long as we have a government, we're always at some risk, but the bigger it is, the greater the risk. So there are any number of things that can be undone, and every time one of them is undone, I think we move in the right direction.
In Against Leviathan, published in 2004, in the introduction you write, "If I had to use a single word to describe what is fundamentally wrong with government today, I would use the word fraud."
I think I would choose that word because it tells us that government is not what it purports to be. It represents itself as everybody's friend and everybody's savior, as if it either knew what to do to achieve those ends or had an incentive to take those actions, even if it knew what to do. And both of those things are historically demonstrably false. Government officials know mainly how to get elected to public office. That's pretty much the extent of what they know. And after that, it's pretense. It's bringing in experts selected by them to do things that purport to be sensible. But of course, they're not going to bring in any experts that propose programs that would really be averse to their political interests.
Thaxton, Virginia. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. I would love to be able to have a very long dinner with your guest. This is just fascinating. Thank you for C-SPAN. How do we recover from the mess, or from the damage that's already been done? Is one of my questions. How do we return to the free market principle where that states if you fail, you fail. You go out of business. Third question would be, how bad do you think this economy is going to get, and how do we recover from it, and can we stop this trend?
Well, getting back to the free market would require that we travel a very, very great distance. So I think for the foreseeable future, the best we can hope for is that we'll move in the right direction. And at present, we're not. We're moving still in the wrong direction of reducing private property rights and enlarging the power and scope of government. So we have to first stop moving in that direction. Now, I will say that because these government actions are so counterproductive, they're self-limiting in a sense. There'll come a time, for example, when government cannot spend any more money. There are limits. The U.S. government acts as if it can spend as much money as it cares to. If it doesn't have the money from tax revenues, it can borrow it. But there may come a time when lenders will not show up, and so it can't be borrowed. And in that case, the government will simply print the money, or as it's done now, electronically credit itself with deposits. But if it continues to take that course long enough and in great enough quantities, it will discover that it simply ruins the dollar and causes its purchasing power to fall towards zero, in which case it will no longer have the power to undertake its projects either. So there are limits, but unfortunately the kinds of limits I've just described are potentially ruinous for certainly our economy and those of us who make it up, as well as many parts of the rest of the world. So well, one certainly hopes that the government will have enough sense to eventually recognize that it's moving in a ruinous direction, to call a halt, and then to move back in a more sensible direction.
And that caller's third point, is it going to get worse?
I think the economic situation will get worse, at least for the next few months. I don't pretend to be a fortune teller, so I'm not going to act as if I can tell you what the future holds. I really don't know, and nor do I think anyone else knows, because it depends on a great many actions that have still to be taken. The government is going to continue taking actions. It's going to continue muddying the waters. And as it does so, private individuals are going to continue to react to changes in the situation and changes in the government's actions. And this action and reaction have consequences, but the consequences are very complex. And so we'll just have to tough it out and see what happens, but I'm quite sure that at least in the next few months the economy is going to worsen and the government is going to continue to take these plausible but actually counterproductive actions.
Spartanburg, South Carolina. You're on the air.
Yes, thank you. Professor Higgs, I was wondering if you could comment on the supposed correlation between free trade and democracy around the world. Some of the biggest free trade countries, China, for example, double-digit GDP growth over the last 10 or 12, 15 years, is still a communist regime. Venezuela, many OPEC nations using their comparative advantage, or some of the most non-democratic nations in the world. How do we address that and the free trade policy that leads to democracy is taking over both parties in Washington, and actually we see the money that has left this country has opened the door for government to come in, step in, and to print more money and to offer retraining when actually citizens in this country were opposed to it to begin with. Thank you, sir.
Well, in my view, free trade is always a good thing for the country that adopts it. It's good in the sense that it gives the individuals in that country the liberty to enter into contracts with anyone they wish, regardless of where the contracting party happens to live. So if I want to make a contract to buy a product from China, I am exercising a liberty to do so, and if the government puts a tariff and makes it more expensive for me to take that action, or if it simply bans the entry of the product or subjects it to a quota or otherwise interferes with its entry into this country, consumers here are made worse off. Now, of course, I take it from your question that you're worried about the effect on some producers and workers in this country who cannot compete with foreign sellers. And of course, that means those people have demonstrated they're not competitive, and the world will have greater wealth if it moves the resources now in those uses to other uses where they have greater value and where people and firms can compete with foreigners. We do ourselves a disservice. We shoot ourselves in the feet whenever we close ourselves off from the world. And historically, when countries have opened up to international trade, they've tended to flourish. This is really distinct from the question of democracy. When the Chinese opened themselves up to trade several decades back, they were certainly not a democracy, and they're not a democracy now. But they've benefited enormously. In fact, I would say that there's no example in human history of progress economically on the scale that we've seen in China in the last 30 years. The number of people who've been lifted from utter poverty to a decent standard of life has been mind-boggling in China. And it's almost entirely owing to China's involvement in international trade. So I'm an enormous believer in free trade. Free trade is just an aspect of freedom, period. And when we shut off free trade, we're exercising the power of government for the benefit of domestic producers who can't compete. And we're all worse off as consumers as a result.
Book TV at cspan.org. If you have an email for Dr. Robert Higgs, Vancouver, Washington, you're on the air.
Dr. Higgs, I'd like to take on this notion of American exceptionalism. In World War I, of course, Eugene Debs was imprisoned for being against the war, and that was followed quickly, of course, by the Red Scare, the McCarthy era, the counterintelligence programs of the 60s. It seems that relative to Western Europe, we have a much less generous nanny state, and I know you would claim to be against the nanny state, but it seems to me what we have is a Wall Street nanny state, and people like you simply have no shame. I own a copy of Socialism by Ludwig von Mises and the Anti-Capitalist Mentality. I've read these people. All you're doing is providing academic cover for Wall Street fascists who want nanny state for the super rich, and the rest of us have to struggle to get by. 5 children were found dead near Tacoma this morning, and it's because of people like you who've shredded the social safety net of this country that people have no place to turn. Do you have no shame?
I do have shame, in fact, and I haven't said a kind word for the recipients on Wall Street of bailouts. I don't know where you got the idea that I was a friend of the rich who are feeding at the public trough. I'm not in favor of that in any way. The safety net you refer to that has been so shredded has in fact never been denser than it is at present. The number of government programs available to people who are in economic difficulty or health difficulty or a variety of other troublesome situations is extremely dense now. It's never had greater funding than it has at present. The exceptions are very few and far between. So it's simply not true that the safety net has been shredded. It's extremely regrettable that the big financial institutions have been able to use their political clout to basically loot the taxpayers in these bailouts of financial institutions. I've never supported that, and I'm not going to start supporting it. But my concerns are not with a group of capitalists. My concern is with human liberties, period. The terrible actions that were taken by the Wilson administration to persecute people during the war and after the war during the Red Scare, all of these subsequent actions government has taken in our history are to be condemned and denounced. And I don't hold a brief in any way for the fascists. I think my work will comport with that. And if you really had read and understood Mises' book, Socialism, and his book, The Anti-Capitalist Mentality, I think you would alter the views from the ones you've expressed.
Dr. Higgs, that gentleman used the term social safety net. What does that mean to you, and do you agree with it?
It's an expression for the various forms of government assistance available, what we generally refer to as the welfare state, income supports, food stamps, housing assistance, et cetera, et cetera. There's an enormous number, now of programs funded by government and managed by government available to assist the needy.
Are they necessary?
I don't think they're necessary. They certainly are necessary in the short run, which is to say if we eliminated them tonight, then tomorrow a large number of people would be in difficulty because they've become dependent on them. But they weren't necessary in the sense that had they never been created, alternative means would have been used to take care of the people who got into trouble, just as alternative means had historically been used throughout our history. People before the creation of these government measures relied on their neighbors, their relatives, their friends in the churches, in the lodges, in the labor unions, and there were thousands upon thousands of fraternal organizations in this country providing assistance to people who were unemployed or sick, or aid to the survivors when people were killed on the job, for example. So that certainly was never the case that no alternatives existed, and had the government never created these welfare state measures, then it doesn't mean that people would have starved in the streets. I don't think it would mean that even if they were all abolished tonight either, because if it did mean that, it would be a terrible statement about the kind of people we are. I think we're better than that, but we've certainly been compromised in our integrity by the existence of these government programs.
And another term that you use so that we can talk about all issues, resurgence of the warfare state. In this book, you write that, I propose that in any consideration of future defense budgetary costs, a well-founded rule of thumb is to take the Pentagon's always well-publicized basic budget total and double it.
A great deal of military spending is not put in the accounts in the Department of Defense category. And some of these elements that are placed elsewhere in the budget are quite large. Certainly, people are aware that the Energy Department is running the nuclear weapons program, but people tend to overlook that Homeland Security, which is certainly a defense function, has a separate department. Veterans Affairs, which is kind of deferred costs of operating the military, has its separate department. And an enormous factor which many people forget about is that in the past, much military spending has been paid for by borrowing money, which meant that the government had to service the debt it went into, and it's still servicing that debt today. So a great deal of the interest costs that the government now pays ought to be attributed to the fact that the government first incurred this debt for the purpose of military expenditures. And those amounts are quite large indeed. And when you add up all of these other elements of military spending that aren't officially accounted for in the Department of Defense budget, you can approximately double that DoD total. It's a rough rule of thumb. It may not be exact at any particular year, but in recent years it's been a good approximation.
Orange County, Missouri, thanks for holding. You're on with Robert Higgs.
Yeah, I'm not as well educated as these other callers have been calling, but, a man said one time, a man is not an island to himself. And as a civilized civilization, we would, if you didn't have a government, you just have mob rule. The strongest guy with the biggest gun would be the leader, right? And so I spent 6 years in the military, tried to defend this government, or did what little bit I could. And I appreciate where we live. And I'm 71 years old now, and I draw Social Security, but I paid Social Security all the time that I worked for 50 years, And I don't feel it's really welfare that I'm drawing. I'm, if I didn't have this income, I've saved enough, I could probably live without it. But on the same token, if I had to go out and compete with people you know, younger than me at this stage in my life to make a living. I don't think I could, you know, really. I'd be down on the lower chain of the ladder there. See, so I think we need a little bit of government in our life, and if we didn't have it, we'd be living in cavemen's days. I'll get off here now.
Thank you, caller.
Well, I'd certainly take exception to the idea that if we didn't have government in its current form, we would have mob rule. I think everything we know about social organization argues against that. People have historically taken care of themselves in almost every respect without reliance on government. And in my view, they could take care of themselves in virtually every regard without reliance on government. They simply haven't had an opportunity to try doing so. But if you think that it's bad without government because the strong would brutalize the weak, just imagine what happens when you place enormous power in the hands of government officials. Then you can certainly expect brutalization and even mass murder eventually. One country after another has seen its government massacre its own citizens. In the 20th century, according to the compilations of Professor Rummel at Hawaii, governments killed more than 200 millions of their own citizens. This is not counting the number of people killed in wars these nations entered into, which killed tens of millions of additional persons. But governments killed hundreds of millions of their own citizens. And if that's the kind of protection that's keeping us from mob rule, I say, let's have mob rule. It's going to cause a lot fewer deaths before people decide that it doesn't make sense to run around in a mob. I think certainly your example of yourself being in trouble if the government were to remove its aid, or as you consider it, its payment that's due you, is certainly true. As I said a few minutes ago, people have come to rely on this government assistance. And if it were withdrawn suddenly, they would be in a great deal of trouble. But it wasn't necessary that they ever came to rely on it. There were alternatives. There were different ways for people to take care of themselves and to take care of others. And those other ways were voluntary and cooperative. But we need to remember that whenever we resort to government, we're resorting to the gun, because government backs up every action it takes from the time it collects its taxes to allow it to operate right on down the line of enforcing every one of its rules with the threat of violence. And all you have to do is continue to resist the government's dictation, and you'll soon enough find yourself exposed to violence, clapped in prison, or shot dead. So this is the alternative. This is the government's way. The government's way is the violent way. To my way of thinking, the private, cooperative way is so much more appealing that it makes no sense to turn to the violent way when we have an alternative available to us.
Email from A.F. Narriman out of Williamsville, New York. We started the conversation talking about fear. Would you agree that it is the opposite emotion, greed, that drives economic bubbles and busts?
I would not agree. I think every time we have a stock market bust, there's a lot of talk about greed. Every time we have some unsustainable run-up in the economy that turns into a recession, people blame it on greed in the preceding period. But greed is actually a sort of social constant. People were just as greedy in the 70s as they were in the 80s, just as greedy in the 90s as they were in the 80s. Greed doesn't fluctuate like that. There's no reason why it should. What fluctuates are government policies. And government policies are what drive the business cycle, for example. Now, that doesn't mean that people never make mistakes. And certainly there are people who have expressed plenty of greed in financial markets or in housing markets in the past 10 years. And so they've certainly played a role in the housing boom and in the stock market boom that we saw before these booms turned to bust. But when we go a step back behind their actions and say, how was it possible for them to undertake the actions they undertook? What did the government do to create incentives for them to take those actions? Where did the money come from? When we start asking those questions, we see that it's not simply greedy individuals that cause these seemingly irrational bubbles, but that they all have identifiable causes in government policy. And we need to take that into account. It's not to say that people make no mistakes. It's not to say that markets are perfect, because markets consist of human beings taking actions in cooperation with one another. So of course they're going to make mistakes. But mistakes are one thing, but the kind of mistakes that give rise to system-wide booms, system-wide economic busts, financial debacles across a wide range, these things invariably have their roots in perverse government policies. Otherwise, the mistakes would be much more randomly distributed over time and space.
Macomb, Georgia. You're on with Robert Higgs.
Hi, Macon, Georgia. We've just had one of the greatest felonies in the history of the world, either one or two ways. A lot of people around the world conspired to get over on the banks and defraud them and put down incomes that weren't right. And all the banks conspired to be so stupid as to accept it without, you know, any checks and balances. And or they themselves somehow got this over on the people, like some of the people have testified to, that the bank said, I'm going to put this down here, don't worry about it. And our government was kind of aware of all this. If you watch the testimony, and the Swiss bank was fined $1 billion for the tax evasion for the companies from America, and yet we just gave them $1 billion. AIG just gave them $1 billion from the bailout, and that came out in the testimony. We have got a gang, an organized gang running our government, and they are stealing from us, and you're acting like people getting a little help is some big, bad thing, but yet we pay for trade adjustment wages and Medicare and food stamps and housing for all the illegal aliens to come over just so that the companies don't pay them $5 an hour, because, woo, that would really hurt them. And, you know, when they can go pay 10 cents a day for the Chinese to work.
All right, caller, we got a lot there on the plate. Dr. Higgs.
I think we've got several issues involved in your question. First of all, the behavior of the banks and of many of the people who borrowed from the banks for mortgages between 2002 and 2006 or 7 is inexcusable. These banks behaved very irresponsibly. They did not do what's called due diligence in making these transactions. Otherwise, they would never have lent money to people who didn't have a fixed address or a documentable income. So there's no excuse for what these banks did. And there is no excuse for bailing them out when they got in trouble as a result. The financial institutions that made these foolish loans and now find themselves insolvent should be allowed to go bankrupt. That would be not only what is productive for the economy, because any good assets they have left would then come into the hands of other people. We would hope more responsible, better managers than the ones that got the firms into the trouble in the first place. As your question suggested, many of the people who borrowed money for housing were also irresponsible. No one twisted their arm, as it were, to sign up for mortgages they had no good prospect of being able to repay, and yet they relied on the foolish idea that they would forever be able to make money from rising housing values. Anybody who's looked into the matter at all knows that real estate rises and falls. It goes through regular cycles historically. So the idea that it was always going to rise and never fall again verged on idiotic. And it was not simply an assumption made by many borrowers, but also an assumption made by people lending money, and people who ought to have known much better than that. But the idea that we are now bailing out these big institutions by basically stealing from the taxpayers to do it is wrong. I denounce those actions. I don't defend them in any way. And it doesn't mean that the people who are taking handouts at the bottom of the economic pyramid are necessarily to be praised either. People should not get what they do not deserve. And people should not get anything by taking it away by force from other people. This is simply stealing. And if it's filtered through the government, it doesn't change the nature of it. It's still stealing with government as a middleman. So I'm not holding a brief for big financial firms, nor am I holding a brief for people who've come to rely on government assistance at the lower reaches of the income spectrum. All of these things are regrettable. It would have been much better for everyone had they never happened. They have happened, and now we find ourselves in such a messy situation that it's well nigh impossible to foresee ever getting free of these kinds of government coercion and returning to a much more peaceful, voluntary arrangement.
Two of your books, Crisis and Leviathan, and Against Leviathan. Who and what is Leviathan?
Well, Leviathan is a term often used to refer to a very big, powerful government, and it goes back to Thomas Hobbes' book called Leviathan from 1650. Hobbes is one of the greatest political philosophers of all time, and people who know anything about his ideas will recall that for Hobbes, Leviathan was a good thing. We need to remember that Hobbes was very much influenced by living at a time of chaos and violence during the English political struggles and warfare in the mid-17th century. And apparently it made him so despondent of the possibility of restoring peace and order that he developed a body of thought in which he said, if we only surrender all our rights to the sovereign in exchange for his keeping the peace, then it'll be a good trade. I myself think it was a bad trade, and once we surrender all our rights to the sovereign, we've got ourselves in a real fix then.
In Against Leviathan, you have some scenarios for creating greater economic equality. Just want to read these to our audience and have you explain this a little bit. Again, scenarios for creating greater economic equality. Number one, the death rate increases abruptly for persons older than 35. Number two, young women find themselves unable to bear children. Number three, a new law requires housewives to enter into paid employment. 4, a new law requires every worker to switch occupations at least once a year. 5, poor robbers increase their plunder on rich victims. 6, people develop an aversion to education and training. And 7, the work week is legally fixed at 20 hours and overtime work is outlawed.
Those were in the nature of reductio ad absurdum to show that the reason some people have much higher incomes than other people has a great deal to do with their taking actions that everyone recognizes as perfectly within their rights and perfectly natural for them to take. If people acquire a lot of education and as a result are able to earn more income, people generally say that's a good thing. And yet, other things equal, that makes income less equally distributed than it was before. We have someone move out of the lower or middle ranks into the upper ranks by virtue of an advanced education. The people in the top ranks of the income distribution work much more. That is, a household often has 2 or even more workers in the labor force, whereas people in the lower ranks of the income distribution often don't work at all or work very little. They have less than 1 full-time worker in the labor force. So there are many reasons that incomes differ, and they're good things. If we got rid of them, we could only do it by tyrannical government actions that would, sure enough, tend to move people toward equality of income, but would be social and economic disasters in the process.
Little Rock, Arkansas, go ahead.
Mr. Higgs, you always bashing the role of government, but I got a question for you. Are you willing to give your Social Security checks back to the government? That comes from the government. Are you willing to do that?
I'm sorry, could you repeat your question?
Are you willing to give your Social Security check back to the government? That comes from the government, and you always bashing the government role. Are you willing to give your Social Security check back?
Do you receive Social Security, and would you be willing to give that check back to the government since that comes from the government, is what that caller is asking you.
Oh, I would I'm not on Social Security, but I would devoutly wish I'd never been made eligible for it, for that matter, because if I had instead been able to keep the money that was taxed away from me for Social Security taxes, I would have been able to invest it in a way that left me much better off than I will ever be if I take the Social Security pension. So, of course, I'd be willing to go back and start when I entered the labor market in 1958 and say, I want to opt out of Social Security from here on out. I would have been delighted to do that. Now, as I said before, if you put people in a position, one, where they cannot opt out, and two, where they're made reliant on government payments, then you've tilted the game. You've put them in a position where now they would be in real difficulty if they were simply to give up what they've relied on receiving for an entire lifetime. But that's a very different matter from saying, would the world have been better off if we'd never had Social Security? It would have been vastly better off. I edited a journal, and I had an article a few issues back by Professor Browning at Texas A&M. And it's an analysis of the Social Security system. And Browning shows in a way that's absolutely irrefutable how much better off virtually everyone would have been if they had never been forced into our Social Security system.
That's the end of our first hour with Robert Higgs of the Independent Institute. We've got 2 more to go. We're going to take a little bit of a break. If you're on hold and you want to stay on hold, we'll come back to your phone call after that. BookTV@cspan.org is the email address. Once again, here are some of Robert Higgs' books. This is his first, The Transformation of the American Economy, 1865 to 1914, published in 1971, I believe. And this one is Competition and Coercion, published by Cambridge. This is the journal that Dr. Higgs edits, the Independent Review, a journal of political economy. Neither Liberty Nor Safety, Fear, Ideology, and the Growth of Government, published in 2007. Government and the American Economy. This is a compilation of essays. Dr. Higgs contributed to that. Depression, War, and Cold War Studies in Political Economy, just out in paperback. Against Leviathan, Government Power in a Free Society. Crisis in Leviathan, Critical Episodes in the Growth of American Government. And Resurgence of the Warfare State, the Crisis Since 9/11. We'll be back after a short break.